What is social justice? As Giorgio Agamben asks in his essay, What is an Apparatus? We must ask, what is social justice? In order to come to terms with the obligations and responsibilities our desire for a more socially just world entails. After all, not only are terminological questions important in philosophy, they are important for the execution of the actions necessary to render them socially tangible and ontologically concrete, in the sense Timothy Morton invokes as the ambient poetics of worlding things in themselving, a Heideggerian notion imported by Marilyn Cooper into the field of rhetoric and composition studies by way of Bruno Latour via Gilles Deleuze. This kind of post-Kantian object-oriented imperative for existence composes provisional totalities out of the collision of life-generative existences that walks us directly into the situation Timothy Morton calls the nature of writing, a situation which, as Marilyn Cooper points out, is not only empirical but also experimental, and I would point out existential, where actors not only realize potentialities as in the structuralist view, but render virtualities actual in the speculative, realist, new materialist ontology espoused by Graham Harman, Manuel Delanda, Charles Bazerman, David R. Russell, and Bruno Latour. As Neil Campbell says in A New Gentleness, Affective Ficta Regionality, when we couple criticism to fiction, to the imaginative, we seek to perform a kind of ethics by asking, what can that thing do that it couldn't do before? What can that sentence say? And in consideration of these things, how has my place in the world shifted? This approach draws on James' notion that the pragmatic truth of entities relies on an established continuity of connection, a trajectory in which entities change over time yet still remain the same entity, as Marilyn Cooper has observed. Cooper's depiction of James's pragmatic truth of entities here sounds similar to Spinoza's concept of conates, as recounted by Kate Rigby writing on Wordsworth's lines written in early spring in her piece Romanticism and Eco-Criticism. The verbal constructions implying an act of reaching out to aspects of the environment, combined with the speaker's profession of faith that in doing so these birds and plants were taking pleasure in their own existence, echo Baruch Spinoza's concept of conatus, that is, the impulse to preserve their being and augment their capacities, to compose and recompose themselves with and through their dynamic relations with others, which he attributed to all physical entities, animate and inanimate, individual and collective. From this Spinozan perspective, the realm of freedom is democratically expanded to incorporate the endeavors of all beings, to preserve a kinetic poise within a dynamic ensemble of relations, an ensemble that also composes them as individuals. Rigby's Spinozan ensemble recurs in Manuel Delanda's popularization of Deleuze-Guattari's concept of assemblages in contemporary philosophy circles with the publication of his 2016 work, Assemblage Theory. This work opened up the Spinozan concept of conatus ensembles to the field of object-oriented ontology, as spearheaded by Graham Harman's pioneering work, Tool Being, where he analyzes the ontological implications of Heideggerian concepts of extension and intention, thus tying Deleuze and Guattari's work on Spinozan assemblages to Heidegger's object-oriented ontology. Both Heidegger and Deleuze and Guattari's work, however, seem inspired by Spinoza's work on extension as represented by his concept conatus, a more sufficient explanation of extension for Heidegger, Husserl, Deleuze, Guattari, and Delanda than the Cartesian one predicated on what will become the transcendental split that divides mind from matter and reason from spirit. The animate world of Spinoza's conatus or ensemble is outgrowing the Cartesian concept of extension, which is trapped in matter and cleaved by its original transcendental split. The ontology of rhetoric in composition classrooms is becoming the rhetoric of the environment as we speak. Or as Byron Hawke says of Paul Cameen's writing classroom, composition instructors are finding a way of enacting Deleuze's expressionism by fostering an ecology in the classroom that will express itself. Old ontological horizons have peaked, and within them the nature of writing is becoming a record of being, where, to adopt the language of Robin Wall Kimmerer, it is now possible to use the grammar of animacy to recompose our relationships to each other and our world by dwelling together in Byron Hawke's sense of classroom design. In the structure of life, as Agamben, Deleuze, and Guattari have examined it, it is the emergent interplay of the apparatus and assemblage in the composition classroom that makes it the ground zero of social justice work in educational institutions. Running through Coxwell, Teague, and Lunsford is the theme of writing to. Writing to implies writing to accomplish something. It recruits the act as a practice of social change. As Margaret M. Strain and Rebecca C. Potter point out in A Degree of Change, the master's degree is positioned in a dynamic contact zone, a place where disciplinary knowledge, student need, and local exigencies interact, and where disciplinary identity is constantly negotiated, so too are all writing instructors positioned in such a charged site of social change. It is here that social justice work comes into play, because the writing classroom is this contact zone, to adopt Kanagaraja's term as inspired by Mary Perry's use of it, where the composition of a distinct social realm transpires in, by, for, and with those participating, and sometimes significantly non-participating, as in the case of an absent mother or father of a school-aged child, agents. To use the Turnian terminology, which I don't find necessary but appreciate the motivation for, we can term them actants. The reason for the Latourian shift in terminology from agent to actant reflects a shift in the interpretation of agency as now relational and less discrete than in the pre-internet age of petty bourgeois imperialism, and emerges in Delanda's discussion of terminology in the opening of assemblage theory. Writing a book about the concept of assemblage presents various challenges. The easiest one to meet is terminological. The word in English fails to capture the meaning of the original agencement, a term that refers to the action of matching or fitting together a set of components, agencer, as well as to the result of such an action, an ensemble of parts that mesh together well. It is here that Delanda asks, what is an assemblage, and provides the answer. It is a multiplicity which is made up of many heterogeneous terms and which establishes liaisons, relations between them across ages, sexes, and reigns, different natures. Thus, the assemblage's only unity is that of a co-functioning. It is a symbiosis, a sympathy. It is never filiations which are important, but alliances, alloys. These are not successions, lines of descent, but contagions, epidemics, the wind. When Agamben analyzes the apparatus as excavated by Foucault, he unearths it as a way of attributing agency to power, where power is not always human, but diversely and myriadly beyond human, climactic, geologic, supernova, supranatural, natural, national, corporate, microscopic, floral, institutional, systemic, geographic, collective, terrestrial, animal, atmospheric, solar. As Foucault says in an interview in 1977, as cited by Agamben, the apparatus is always inscribed into a play of power. He uses the term quite often, especially from the mid-1970s, when he begins to concern himself with what he calls governmentality, or the government of men. The ambient poetics of Timothy Morton, the speculative realism of Harman and Delanda, and the new materialism of Jane Bennett are thus quite comfortable at the party with Foucault, where the shift in reading agency as implicitly human intuitively occurred in order to convey the story of institutional, transspecial, non-supra, and extra-human agency. According to Agamben, the transpersonal superhuman apparatus was always the object of Foucault's thought. Although still focused on Hegel's formulation of positivity in the archaeology of knowledge, Agamben noted that Foucault, by borrowing this term, positivity, from Hegel, later to become apparatus, had already taken a position with respect to a decisive problem, which is actually also his own problem, the relation between individuals as living beings and the historical element. To return to the question we opened with, then, let's describe social justice as an apparatus by pairing the Agamben formulation with Delanda's and posing both questions as one. What is the apparatus of social justice? And for our purposes, how can the apparatus of social justice assemblages be understood in relation to the teaching of rhetoric and composition? Another way to think of this is how to, in Jennifer Restano's application of Arendtian methodology, think what we are doing within the field of rhetoric and composition pedagogy with the objective of recomposing the apparatus of instruction via the assemblage of participating agents. If the antidote, in other words, to what Restano deems dangerous complacency with the institutions where rhetoric and composition education occurs, if the antidote is dramatic doing, how do the tool beings of apparatuses and assemblages help us do the socially just work in an emerging landscape where dangerous complacency remains an actor in the story? Neil Campbell provides the start of an answer in The New Gentleness, where he points out that new forms of writing bring these types of questions to life on the page because fictocriticism is concerned with our linguistic, discursive, and especially textual practices of being in the world. If, as Mark Mossman points out, our responses to social injustice in our institutions have failed to articulate this set of problems themselves and have been built on faulty assumption hysteria and a willful self-marginalization rather than on an actual engagement with the reality of what has been happening for decades in the higher education industry, then writing as a way to recompose the conditions of our existence through the creative engagement and use of language arts becomes social justice work from the word go. To return to Agamben, however, it becomes clear that the only way to really answer the question, what is social justice, is to be capable of changing the apparatus through which social justice occurs or does not occur, is administered, realized, extinguished, or actualized. So, what is the apparatus of social justice? It is the assemblages, in the Delandian, Deleuze-Guattari Spinozian sense of the conatus or ensemble, by which agency is relationally redistributed through the field, and so reconciled as transpersonal, interspecial, non- and superhuman and human, personal, institutional, and historical at once, transcendental and immanent, this new holographic quantum model of consciousness which distributes agency and animacy differently than during the pre-silicon carbon-based industrial period, is collaboratively creating itself in self-aware states of engagement based on the respective autonomy of all various cohabitating parts, just as the hand to the person to whom it is attached, or the violin by the cello in the symphony of which they are both part, respectfully experiencing and recognizing as autonomous and coterminous their elements in the field of being. This brings The Friend, Agamben's essay, The Friend, into focus. If it is only when those who are concerned with the problem will be able to intervene in their own processes of subjectification, as Agamben says, then it is the ontological basis of Aristotle's theory of friendship that creates the conditions by which the apparatus of oppression can be recomposed into an apparatus of democratically self-organizing, self-representing, self-regulating freedoms. It is the ontology of friendship that solves Sir what Agamben frames as the problem of the profanation of apparatuses, that is to say, the need for the restitution to common use of what has been captured and separated in them. This hinges on the consenting of good persons to coexist, as Aristotle expresses in the Nicomachean Ethics and Agamben recounts in The Friend. Sensing that we are alive is in and of itself sweet, for life is by nature good, and it is sweet to sense that such a good belongs to us. Living is desirable above all for those who are good, since for them existing is a good and sweet thing. For good men, consenting, synesthesia or sensing together, feels sweet because they recognize the good itself. And what a good person feels with respect to herself, she also feels with respect to her friend. The friend is in fact an other self, a heteros autos. And as all people find the fact of their own existence, to oiton inai, desirable, the existence of their friends is equally or almost equally desirable. Existence is desirable because one senses that it is a good thing, and this sensation, aesthesis, is in itself sweet. One must therefore also consent that his friend exists, and this happens by living together and by sharing acts and thoughts in common, koinonin. It is this sense, in this sense, that we say humans live together, sizin. Friendship is, in fact, a community, and as we are with respect to ourselves, so we are as well with respect to our friends. And as the sensation of existing, aesthesis hoti estin, is desirable for us, so would it also be for our friends. By this means, we arrive at the definition that social justice means to be capable of changing the apparatus of oppression that has been captured and implicates people in the expression of their own subjectification through the restitution of the ontological ground of our being, which is fundamentally relational. And as our old friend Aristotle once pointed out, the ground of our being. We are the ground of our being. Let us tend to that soil.